Hi learners, we meet once again to continue with our history lesson. My name is Remekius Ngwenya, the history coordinator in the Gauteng province. Today I want us to talk about essay writing in history. One of the sections in assessment that gives people a lot of challenges is essay writing. Today I want you to take your notes, you take your scribbler, and you start writing what I'm going to emphasize or what I'm going to highlight as very much important for learners to write good essay in history. Now, before I start talking about the essay writing, I want to emphasize this point, that in history, you attend to essay as in a form of a debate or a symposium. In history, you either take a stand of agreeing to the event or disagreeing to the investigation. So it is very much important to know that when you write a history essay, there's a particular position that you must take, either agreeing or disagreeing. But we will discuss this as we look into question verbs that are used by examiners to assess essays in history. Now, what I want to emphasize is that there are certain requirements that you need to follow when you write an essay. Essay writing requires learners to take a stance, as I have emphasized, to develop a relevant and a coherent line of argument. For you to be able to write a properly contextualized essay, you need to take a particular stance to develop a line of argument. Now, the line of argument must be supported with relevant historical evidence. In history, when you argue with evidence. There has to be evidence that base your argument, whether you are agreeing or you are disagreeing. You have to take a line of argument by providing evidence. And that evidence is organized in a chronological or in a sequential order from one particular period to the other. Now, what does an essay entails? Learners tend to write essays in different subjects and in different formats. But what does history essay entails? History essay involves a structure. There has to be a particular structure that you must follow. And that structure has to be noted as the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. The structure is not just a physical appearance, but structure talks to relevant evidence or relevant facts that you must use when you write. Now, essay must have an introduction, a coherent body, and a compelling conclusion. Those are the three aspects that one must follow to make a fully comprehensive essay. There has to be an introduction, there has to be the body of your essay, and there has to be a conclusion. That would one say that this is an acceptable essay in history writing. Now, what is an introduction and how must it look like? When you write a history essay, how should your introduction look like, or how do you show that you are introducing the topic or the question that has been posed in that essay question? Now, the introduction, when you write an essay, it should be clear that you are directly responding to the question. If the introduction does not address the question, then that introduction is not properly contextualized. It must respond to the question. The introduction must tell us what is it that you are going to discuss in your essay. What content are you going to discuss? All essays should be indicative that I'm going to talk about this and that and that. As we will continue, I will demonstrate this to you. A history essay also has to have a line of argument. Remember when I started my lesson, I indicated to you that if you are a history learner, you need to know that you are in a form of a debate or you are in a form of a symposium. You are not neutral. You need to take a stance, whether you are for or you are against. Now, in your argument, there has to be facts that proves to the rest of your essay that this is your point and this is how you will prove it. Then the introduction must tell us what kind of a line of argument are you going to follow before you give us the body of your essay. Now, this is very much important. If I read the first sentence of your paragraph or your first paragraph as an introduction, and you cannot work out what the original question is, then your introduction has failed its purpose. The purpose of an introduction is to directly responding to the question. What does the question want? What does the question expect me to do? You need to highlight that. Should the introduction not address that, it means your introduction has failed its primary course. One would not know how your essay is going to unfold if you do not indicate what is it that you are going to discuss in your essay. Then your essay has lost relevancy. There are 3 steps that one must master when you write an introduction. Without these 3 steps, your introduction may be flawed. You have to follow the 3 steps that will make you to be credited whenever you write a properly contextualized introduction in a form of an essay. 1, as I said, step 1, you take a stance. It means you need to agree or you disagree in an essay. Step 2, you need to give a reason. Why do you agree? You don't just agree and not give a reason or disagree and not give a reason. So in your introduction, if you take a stance, you say, I agree because, or I disagree because. You have to mention the reason for your stance. That is your second point. The third point, you need to give evidence. You need to give historical evidence as to how your agreement or your disagreement is going to be explained throughout the essay. So therefore, if you don't take these 3 steps as important steps to guide you in writing an introduction, your introduction may not be properly contextualized. It may lose meaning. The reader may not understand why are you taking a stance. A reader may not understand what is your essay going to cover. So the 3 steps are very much important. Every time you look at an essay, there are 3 steps that you must consider when you write an introduction. Take a stance, give a reason why are you taking that stance, and give us a bit of evidence as to how your essay is going to look like or what is it that is going to cover. Now, I want to practically demonstrate this thing to you. Here is an essay question on the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s. The question says, explain to what extent the various forms of international resistance by the anti-apartheid movement led to the eventual demise of the National Party in the 1980s. You support your line of argument with relevant evidence. Now, as I have said in the beginning, 1, you have to explain to what extent. Remember, you have to take a particular stance when you write an essay, whether to a lesser extent or to no extent or to a more extent. You have to take a line of position to say, I'm agreeing or I'm disagreeing to this level. Then you need then to look at various forms. That's what the question wants. The various forms of international resistance. as how they led to the fall of apartheid in the 1980s. And as you argue, you need to provide historical evidence. History is no history without relevant evidence that speaks to the event that occurred. You need to make use of events as evidence that base your argument. Right. Now, if you have a question of this nature, remember the 3 steps that I talked about. If you have a question of this nature that says, to what extent various forms of international resistance through the anti-apartheid movement led to the fall of apartheid, you then remember the 3 steps that I talked about. 1, to a greater extent. Look at how I respond to the question. To a greater extent, various forms of international protest, such as sanctions, boycotts, contributed immensely to the demise of apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s. 1 will further elaborate on the impact protest had to bring apartheid to its knees. Now, take a look at this introduction. 1, I have taken the step 1 of a stance. 2, I'm addressing the question. Remember, you need to pose to the question that has been asked. Various forms of protest. Then I give evidence. What are those protests? Sanctions, boycotts, and so forth, as part of introduction. Then I also explained how the essay is going to address. The essay is going to be looking at the impact of the protest towards the demise of apartheid. Now, when you look at this introduction, you can see that 1, I have taken a stance. 2, I have indicated why I have taken that stance by giving evidence. And 3, I also explain how the essay is going to unfold. The essay is going to be looking at the impact. It will elaborate on the impact protest had during the apartheid system. So if you remember quite well, I will go back a little bit and I say to you, there are 3 steps that I have taken. 1, I have indicated to a lesser extent, or to a large extent. 2, I have given the reason why I have taken that stance. 3, I have given a guide as to what evidence am I going to follow to write this essay in a form of protest and sanctions. Right. Now, once you have completed your introduction, then you must write now the body of your essay. Remember, I said to you, essay entails a structure. And that structure consists of the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Now we have talked about the introduction, which wants us to take the 3 steps that I have mentioned. Now, how do you then write the body of your essay so that it has that evidence that is needed in a form of line of argument? The body of an essay should have factual information. Now, if your essay does not have facts, that essay will lose marks because there's no relevant information that you use to base your argument. We need to have facts, and those facts must be linked to the argument, the line of argument, the question that has been posed. Remember, I talked about the sanctions, the boycotts in the introduction as part of examples that I will use to base my argument on how they have contributed to the fall of apartheid. Now, the body of an essay should be well structured. Right? Now, what does that mean? It means your paragraphs must have a flow. That must be clear to the reader that what I am reading is not just a writing that is clustered. You need to separate your paragraphs by writing, by following a structure. And the structure must be chronological. It means, like in history, there is this chronological order that you must follow. Every time about this event started in 1980, and then in 1981, 1982, 1983, up until 1990, for an example. Then we talk about chronology or coherent manner. Right. Now, when you write an essay, remember to give examples that you have taken a stance. The stance that you have taken, every now and then it has to be highlighted. If you said to a lesser extent, it must always be reflecting in the body of your essay that you are following the stance that you have taken. Right. Now, essay writing in history, as I said, requires a structure. What is that structure? That structure, we call it the Peel system. The Peel system has to do with the point, which is the opening statement of your paragraph. Every time you enter into a new paragraph, you must give us a point. What is the point that you want to highlight as a form of an argument in your essay? Once you have highlighted the point, then you must explain it to us. What is this point all about? So the opening sentence of your paragraph must be clear. It must be simple, and it must talk to what the point that you are raising is. Explain the next few sentences in your paragraph should explain the point you have made. Now, if I make a point and not explain it, then what's the use of writing that point? When you make a point, as you are arguing, you need to explain why are you taking that point? Why are you giving us that point? Then, after explaining the point, you must give evidence. Remember what I said about history? If there is no proper evidence to argue, your essay will be meaningless. You need to have evidence, or in a form of examples that you must give, which is the base of your argument. Then, lastly, you have to link, which is the fourth part in the Peel structure. At the end of your paragraph, you must always link back to the essay question. Remember, the question talked about the fall of apartheid by international response. Now, if I made a point, I must always go back to my question when I wrap up my paragraph. Now, what does this Peel system tells us? This Peel system tells us that there's no way a learner can be irrelevant in writing an essay, because if you have a point, you explain it, you give examples, and then you link back to the question, your essay will be properly contextualized, and your body will be accepted because you have followed a particular structure. So if you don't follow this kind of a structure, your essay may lose meaning. Ensure that the Peel structure is followed every time you write your essay. Now, I want to practically demonstrate the Peel structure to you. Now, let's say, for an example, here is a point under the international response. It is called sports boycott. Now, when you explain, you need to indicate what happened. Like, for an example here, the Commonwealth countries signed the Gleneagles Agreement in 1977, banning South African sports from participating in the world sports. This is explaining the point sport boycott. What happened? South Africa sports was banned from participating internationally. Now, when you elaborate, remember this is a Peel structure. We start with a point, we explain, we give example or elaborate and link. When you elaborate, then you would say, South Africa was suspended from FIFA, from African football, as well as other football organizations. That is the example that you are giving in edifying your explanation. Then when you link back, you would say by the late 1980s, South Africa was banned from 90% of world sport. And that impacted negatively on the apartheid government. Remember the question, how did the international organization lead to the fall of the apartheid government? So under sports boycott, we can see that the government was highly affected. Right, consumer boycott is another point that I want us to talk about. Under this point, you would say South African products were rejected by the international community as an explanation. Then elaboration, we've got all these examples of companies that withdrew their investment in South Africa as part of examples. Then how do you link that to your question? South Africa created a financial crisis and the rand dropped by 35%, an indication that this boycott impacted negatively on the apartheid government. Then we've got cultural boycott, for an example, as a point. Now, under this, you would indicate how the Equity Group, which were banned from screening in the SABC, and its members were banned from touring South Africa. Now, culturally, it means South Africa also was under severe pressure to change the apartheid system. We've got the Freedom Concert that took place in London, which called an end to apartheid as part of an example. We've got artists which were against the apartheid system from Britain, right? And in 1985, these artists united themselves against South Africa. And what is the link? How do you refer back to the question? South African music could not be promoted internationally. Then what does that mean? The apartheid government was affected. Right. Then there's disinvestment as another point. Under disinvestment, the anti-apartheid movement put Britain companies pressure to withdraw their investment. And as an example, we've got Sweden, which was the first industrial country to disinvest in South Africa. 1984, foreign investment started dropping, which means apartheid had a negative reception by the international world. General Motors, Barclays started pulling out of South Africa. These are examples of disinvestment. You first give a point, explain, elaborate, and link back to the question. In all your paragraphs, apply the PEEL system. You will not go wrong. Right. Then we've got also sanctions. Archbishop Tutu convinced USA and Britain to impose sanctions on South Africa. How do we elaborate that? In 1982, the United Nations condemned apartheid and called for sanctions in South Africa because of its practice. In 1985, the European Economic Community banned new investment in South Africa. And how do you link that? The rand in South Africa was devalued. It means it lost value because of sanctions. Right, there was also a campaign that was called Free Mandela Campaign. The anti-apartheid movement demanded the immediate release of Mandela. And the anti-apartheid movement and its campaign had a huge pressure on South Africa to release political prisoners. F.W. de Klerk announced the unbanning of the liberation or the liberation of prisoners. In February 1990, Mandela was released due to this campaign. Then how do you link back to the question? His freeing was greeted with celebrations throughout the UK and elsewhere. So which means the British anti-apartheid movement through the Free Mandela campaign also contributed to the fall of apartheid. Right, then we conclude our essay. How do you conclude your essay? Learners, you must round off your argument. Remember that I said an essay consists of historical evidence in a form of argument. How do you close that? You close it by rounding off. You round off your argument. Right. How do you do that? In many cases, this will consist of restarting the main line of argument. You restart your main line. Remember what your main line is? Your main line was to explain various forms of international response that led to the fall of apartheid in the 1980s. Now, you revert back, which means you go back to your argument to show that you are now closing off, right, with conclusive evidence. Remember what I said to you, if you do not have line of argument through evidence, your essay will be meaningless. Your essay won't have much accreditation. You won't be credited the marks that you deserve. But should you give evidence, you are sure of good marks out of 50 when you write an essay. Right now, how do you conclude? Remember, I demonstrated the introduction. Now, I want you to take a note of how this essay is concluded. Should you follow this pattern, I'm telling you, your essay will always be par excellent because you will be getting marks as you have written a properly contextualized and acceptable essay. Now, how do you write the conclusion? You say, the discussion above provided enough evidence to prove that various forms of protest, such as boycotts, sanctions, and the AMM, contributed to the fall of apartheid in the 1980s. Now, whenever you write a conclusion, always go back to your introduction. Your introduction wanted you to make mention of what? The various forms of protest. In conclusion, you also have to revert back to the various forms of anti-apartheid movement and give examples. You can also make an introduction to be the same with conclusion. If you say to a larger extent, or as I have explained, that to a larger extent, international forms of resistance, such as protest, boycotts, and sanctions, contributed to the fall of the apartheid government. So it's easy if you follow this pattern. The 3 steps that have been taken in the introduction can also be followed in the conclusion. Because there in the conclusion, you need to have what we call the conclusive statement. This shows that I am rounding off my essay. When I say the discussion above, it means I am no longer discussing, I am concluding my essay. Then it says the discussion above proved that to a greater extent, remember the stance that I have taken, to what extents were various protests? And I have said in my introduction, to a large extent. I emphasize in my conclusion the stance that I have taken as the second point. The first point, I must have a conclusive statement or a statement of conclusion or a statement of rounding off. Secondly, I then go to my line of argument to say, this is the stance that I have taken. And this is the evidence such as boycotts, sanctions, and so forth, led to the demise of apartheid. In that case, this is a properly contextualized conclusion. So we've got a properly contextualized introduction. We've got a properly contextualized conclusion. We also have a body, a compelling body that has evidence in a form of a pill structure. Every time you are to write an essay, you need to know that I have the content of that particular topic. 2, how do I write the essay? First, you look at the 3 steps that I must take whenever I write. Take a stance, give an orientation, and support your line of argument. Without that, your introduction will not be clear or be properly contextualized. It will not be accepted as the historical evidence or researched essay. So therefore, the last part, which is the conclusion, you also need to have a conclusive statement. You need to give the stance that you have taken once more, and also you need to give evidence. Once you do that, then your essay will be accepted as a properly contextualized essay. Now, I want us to look at the statement that I started with so that you have a clear understanding. Here is an essay question. Explain to what extent, that is the rule of the question, to what extent. What is it that I must explain? Various forms of international resistance against the apartheid. And how do I explain this? By looking for relevant evidence. Those are the most important parts that you need to know. So, as I have demonstrated to you, to a greater extent, that is the standpoint. 2 examples of the line of argument, international response such as sanctions, boycotts, and so forth. And lastly, how these will impact on the apartheid system, as an impact to the apartheid system. So the 3 points that I have taken simply means that my introduction is properly contextualized and my introduction is acceptable in a form of history essay structure. I want to go back to you and say to you again, your body will not be accepted if it does not have factual information. Your body will not be accepted if it does not have line of argument in a form of boycotts, sanctions that you must cover as part of your structure in the body. And make sure that your body is paragraphed in a way that is chronological or is coherent. It makes meaning that you are writing a history essay. Then every time you write a point, you must give an example. Remember the pill structure that I talked about? Point, example, give evidence, and you link back to the question. In that case, if your pill structure is applied in all your paragraphs, there's no way that your essay will be irrelevant. And there's no way that your essay will be out of line because you are following a particular line of argument. Ensure that every time you write a paragraph, make sure that you have your point, you explain it, you elaborate, you link back to the question. Don't forget that every time you conclude a paragraph, ensure that you link back to the question that wanted you to show how the apartheid government was affected at that time. So these are the important aspects that I want us to know, or I want to emphasize on. As I wrap up in closing, I want to emphasize to you that In essay history, there are 3 questions that you need to know and you need to master. One of them is either agreeing or disagreeing. 2, to a large extent or to what extent. And 3 is critically discuss. Those are the 3 question verbs that you will find in essay questions when you write your examination. Now, critically discuss is one of the aspects that learners tend not to get marks on when they write an essay. But critically discuss wants the learner to look at the negatives and the positives of the event and come to a decision. As I have mentioned before, when you write a history essay, you are like in a debate. You need to take a stance. It means you have to take a line of position to say, I do agree or I disagree or I am not in agreement with what the statement is saying. You cannot be neutral. In that case, you will be able to give evidence of why do you take that stance. If you say yes, why do you say yes? If you say no, why do you say no? In that case, you can be in a position to get good marks in essay writing. The essay writing has a particular structure, as I said, which we use to mark your essay. If your essay has a properly contextualized introduction, a compelling body of evidence, and a properly contextualized conclusion, there's no way that you will get lower marks in your essay writing. This is one of the examples that I had to demonstrate so that you can see what is it that you need to do in writing the essay. I strongly believe that this will help you to write a properly contextualized essay in history. We're still going to use various forms of examples in other forms of essay like the road to democracy, the collapse of USSR, the extension of the Cold War in China, the civil rights movement, as well as the independence of Africa. We will be looking at how essays in those topics can be attempted, or you can answer them in this way using the 3 formats in terms of the essay question verbs, and follow the 3 steps to the introduction and the conclusion, and follow the pill structure in your body. With those words, I hope you understand what I have been trying to say to you. Take note of everything that I have highlighted. When you write an essay, following this strategy, you will not go wrong. With that, learners, thank you. See you next time.